So I wanted to give you some background info and context for this reading because it might be a more difficult piece than some other things that we'll read, and it also assumes some background knowledge that you may or may not have. So first, why did I choose this? Well, one of the things that I wanted this class to convey to you is that these debates about data's effect on marginalized people are a lot older than you may think. I thought it might surprise you to learn that people were already talking about this stuff in the 19th century. I also wanted to expose you a little bit to the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, whose thinking on this topic is, I think, really foundational. Du Bois is this towering figure in Black thought and in the social sciences in general, and he was experimenting with data in really perceptive ways throughout his career. And his writing and thinking about categorization and what it means to be human are super important. So that's why we're spending 2 classes talking about his idea of double consciousness. I think that the way that he thought about this has a lot to teach us about working with data. Another thing I like about this Womack reading is that it gives you a sense of how messy and contingent actual history is. In order to understand what Black cultural producers were doing in this period, Womack has to call on so many areas of scholarship: anthropology, media studies, critical data studies, aesthetics, literature, just to name a few. So it's a really nice example of how much thought and research is required to make a historical claim, even about a relatively short period of time. Okay, so some background. As you'll see, Womack is writing about a period she calls post-Reconstruction. And you might already know what Reconstruction is, although I don't think I learned about it until pretty late, so maybe you haven't encountered it. The term refers to the dozen or so years after the Civil War, so about 1865 to 1877. If you take a minute to imagine what that must have been like, you can start to get a sense of how many questions and how much tension was in the air. The United States had spent centuries insisting that Black people weren't human beings, and now it had to figure out how to draw them into the circle of citizenship while also reuniting the North and the South. And people intensely disagreed about how to do this, and even whether to do this, and what it should look like. It might surprise you to learn that Reconstruction saw the founding of the first public schools and historically Black colleges, the first civil rights laws, and the first extension of the suffrage to African Americans. 16 Black people served in Congress during Reconstruction. So in a lot of ways, it had this potential to be a moment of really intoxicating possibility. But it was also a period of intense backlash and extremely violent racism. White Southerners were not about to give up power without a fight. So this period saw the rise of the KKK and the ascension to power of some truly racist figures, like Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Confederate lieutenant general who served as Grand Wizard of the KKK. Mobs destroyed Black communities, churches, schools, terrorized families. Now, when Rutherford B. Hayes took office in 1877 as president, he did so on the back of a secret backroom deal with Southern Democrats in which he agreed to Southern home rule, meaning that the federal government would withdraw its troops and wouldn't interfere with Southern states. There was a sense that Reconstruction had failed in its goal of settling on a way to integrate Black people into the nation, although, as historians like Eddie Glaude point out, Reconstruction didn't fail. Reconstruction was deliberately killed. But anyway, I think that's part of why Womack has chosen this period to write about. So this is post-Reconstruction. The big question in the air is, what now? What is this nation going to look like? How do we understand human beings' relationships to each other? And the other thing that's happening during this period is this effusion of energy around classifying, measuring, quantifying, and organizing knowledge. Another name for this period is the Progressive Era, and people really believed that with enough effort and knowledge, they could scientifically eliminate all of society's ills. It was a very optimistic period, scientifically speaking. So think about Charles Darwin and the popularization of the theory of evolution, but also think about Francis Galton, an originator of eugenics. At the time, eugenics was not a dirty word. Because remember, World War II hadn't happened yet, and there wasn't the same sense that attempting to purify people's bloodlines would inevitably lead to genocide. So, very prominent and well known historical figures like Theodore Roosevelt and Margaret Sanger thought that eugenics was a great idea. So, you've got these big questions about race on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have this new enthusiasm for measuring and classifying. So, it's no wonder that Womack sees this as an important moment to investigate the relationship between race and data, because many people did believe in the power of this new kind of information to advance the cause of humanity. And one of the ways that they wanted to do it was by classifying and measuring and organizing and quantifying race. Womack is really interested in the collision of these two social forces, and she's especially interested in Black writers and thinkers who responded to them in their work. And that's part of why the chapter opens with that short piece from W.E.B. Du Bois. As Womack tells us, Du Bois understood very early that there was an inherent conflict between Black social life and the imperative to turn everything into data. Remember, race relies on categorization. You can't have one without the other. And the way that this categorization has worked throughout American history has been to place races in a hierarchy, with white people at the top and Black people at the bottom. And that's why Womack keeps talking about the racial calculus. She means the arithmetic you need to do in order to value white life above Black life. Du Bois understood that in order to perform that calculation, you needed to organize and quantify, and that's part of why he was so wary of measurement and quantification. He knew that the very act of quantification is tied up with the existence of the racial calculus, and he understood that data had enormous power to harm. But, and this is part of why we're talking about him so much, he also thought that perhaps with enough experimentation, data could be a tool for building power. And that's why his work with data visualization is so interesting and important. Du Bois is telling us how he thinks data might be used to advance the rights and the freedom of the oppressed. Womack is really interested in this, and she's also really interested in all the moments of experimentation during this period. She says that in the work of a range of cultural producers, we can see these experiments with classification and organization and data at a time when the future of data hadn't been written yet. We didn't know what data was going to be. And so she's not so interested in using these artists' and writers' work as a recipe or a prescription to kind of tell you what to do. She's more interested in using it as a way to imagine possibilities that might not have occurred to us, because history has come to understand data in a very specific way, and we are conditioned by history to understand it in a very specific way. So there are a few questions I think it might be useful for you to bear in mind as you read. First, why is Womack so interested in aesthetics? What does she think that aesthetics has to do with data? Womack talks a lot about this panic that comes when something defies categorization. Why would formlessness make people panic at this moment in time? I've mentioned a few forces that came into play during this period, like the question of integration and the enthusiasm for measurement, but Womack is really good at conveying how complicated and messy this period is. So can you find other forces that Womack thinks are intersecting during this period to produce the phenomena she's documenting? What kind of work is this book? It's a little unusual. Is it history? Is it literary studies, sociology, or something else altogether? And finally, Womack talks about, quote, undisciplining data. What do you think that means? And why do you think she thinks it's important? I hope you enjoy reading this chapter. It might take a little longer than some of our other readings, but I think it really does reward close scrutiny because it's a very rich text.